Chapter 13 of The Further Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. This recording is in the public domain. The Further Adventures of Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Chapter 13. Arrival in China. The greater weight the anxieties and perplexities of these things were to our thoughts while we were at sea, the greater was our satisfaction when we saw ourselves on shore; and my partner told me he dreamed that he had a very heavy load upon his back, which he was to carry up a hill, and found that he was not able to stand longer under it; but that the Portuguese pilot came and took it off his back, and the hill disappeared, the ground before him appearing all smooth and plain. And truly it was so; they were all like men who had a load taken off their backs. For my part I had a weight taken off from my heart that it was not able any longer to bear; and as I said above, we resolved to go no more to sea in that ship. When we came on shore the old pilot, who was now our friend, got us a lodging, together with a warehouse for our goods. It was a little hut, with a larger house adjoining to it, built and also palisadoed round with canes, to keep out pilferers, of which there were not a few in that country. However, the magistrates allowed us a little guard, and we had a soldier with a kind of half pike, who stood sentinel at our door, to whom we allowed a pint of rice and a piece of money about the value of 3d. per day, so that our goods were kept very safe. The fair or mart usually kept at this place had been over some time. However, we found that there were 3 or 4 junks in the river, and 2 ships from Japan, with goods which they had bought in China, and were not gone away, having some Japanese merchants on shore. The first thing our old Portuguese pilot did for us was to get us acquainted with 3 missionary Romish priests who were in the town, and who had been there some time converting the people to Christianity; but we thought they made but poor work of it, and made them but sorry Christians when they had done. One of these was a Frenchman, whom they called Father Simon; another was a Portuguese; and a third a Genoese. Father Simon was courteous, and very agreeable company, but the other 2 were more reserved, seemed rigid and austere, and applied seriously to the work they came about, viz., to talk with and insinuate themselves among the inhabitants wherever they had opportunity. We often ate and drank with those men; and though I must confess the conversion, as they call it, of the Chinese to Christianity is so far from the true conversion required to bring heathen people to the faith of Christ, that it seems to amount to little more than letting them know the name of Christ, and say some prayers to the Virgin Mary and her Son, in a tongue which they understand not, and to cross themselves, and the like. Yet it must be confessed that the religionists, whom we call missionaries, have a firm belief that these people will be saved, and that they are the instruments of it; and on this account they undergo not only the fatigue of the voyage, and the hazards of living in such places, but oftentimes death itself, and the most violent tortures, for the sake of this work. Father Simon was appointed, it seems, by order of the chief of the mission, to go up to Pekin, and waited only for another priest, who was ordered to come to him from Macao, to go along with him. We scarce ever met together but he was inviting me to go that journey, telling me how he would show me all the glorious things of that mighty empire, and among the rest Pekin, the greatest city in the world. "A city," said he, "that your London and our Paris put together cannot be equal to." But as I looked on those things with different eyes from other men, so I shall give my opinion of them in a few words, when I come in the course of my travels to speak more particularly of them. Dining with Father Simon one day, and being very merry together, I showed some little inclination to go with him, and he pressed me and my partner very hard to consent. "Why, father," says my partner, "should you desire our company so much? You know we are heretics, and you do not love us, nor cannot keep us company with any pleasure." "Oh," says he, "you may perhaps be good Catholics in time; my business here is to convert heathens, and who knows but I may convert you too." "Very well, father," said I, "so you will preach to us all the way?" "I will not be troublesome to you," says he. "Our religion does not divest us of good manners. Besides, we are here like countrymen, and so we are, compared to the place we are in; and if you are Huguenots, and I a Catholic, we may all be Christians at last. At least we are all gentlemen, and we may converse so, without being uneasy to one another." I liked this part of his discourse very well, and it began to put me in mind of my priest that I had left in the Brazils; but Father Simon did not come up to his character by a great deal; for though this friar had no appearance of a criminal levity in him, yet he had not that fund of Christian zeal, strict piety, and sincere affection to religion that my other good ecclesiastic had. But to leave him a little, though he never left us, nor solicited us to go with him, we had something else before us at first, for we had all this while our ship and our merchandise to dispose of, and we began to be very doubtful what we should do, for we were now in a place of very little business. Once I was about to venture to sail for the river of Kilam and the city of Nankin, but Providence seemed now more visibly, as I thought, than ever to concern itself in our affairs, and I was encouraged from this very time to think I should, one way or other, get out of this entangled circumstance, and be brought home to my own country again, though I had not the least view of the manner. Providence, I say, began here to clear up our way a little, and the first thing that offered was, that our old Portuguese pilot brought a Japan merchant to us, who inquired what goods we had, and in the first place he bought all our opium, and gave us a very good price for it, paying us in gold by weight, some in small pieces of their own coin, and some in small wedges, of about 10 or 12 ounces each. While we were dealing with him for our opium, it came into my head that he might perhaps deal for the ship too, and I ordered the interpreter to propose it to him. He shrunk up his shoulders at it when it was first proposed to him, but in a few days after he came to me, with one of the missionary priests for his interpreter, and told me he had a proposal to make to me, which was this. He had bought a great quantity of our goods, when he had no thoughts of proposals made to him of buying the ship, and that, therefore, he had not money to pay for the ship; but if I would let the same men who were in the ship navigate her, he would hire the ship to go to Japan, and would send them from thence to the Philippine Islands with another loading, which he would pay the freight of before they went from Japan, and that at their return he would buy the ship. I began to listen to his proposal, and so eager did my head still run upon rambling, that I could not but begin to entertain a notion of going myself with him, and so set sail from the Philippine Islands away to the South Seas. Accordingly, I asked the Japanese merchant if he would not hire us to the Philippine Islands, and discharge us there. He said no, he could not do that, for then he could not have the return of his cargo; but he would discharge us in Japan, at the ship's return. Well, still I was for taking him at that proposal, and going myself; but my partner, wiser than myself, persuaded me from it, representing the dangers, as well of the seas as of the Japanese, who are a false, cruel, and treacherous people; likewise those of the Spaniards at the Philippines, more false, cruel, and treacherous than they. But to bring this long turn of our affairs to a conclusion, the first thing we had to do was to consult with the captain of the ship, and with his men, and know if they were willing to go to Japan. While I was doing this, the young man whom my nephew had left with me as my companion came up, and told me that he thought that voyage promised very fair, and that there was a great prospect of advantage, and he would be very glad if I undertook it; but that if I would not, and would give him leave, he would go as a merchant, or as I pleased to order him; that if ever he came to England, and I was there and alive, he would render me a faithful account of his success, which should be as much mine as I pleased. I was loath to part with him, but considering the prospect of advantage, which really was considerable, and that he was a young fellow likely to do well in it, I inclined to let him go; but I told him I would consult my partner and give him an answer the next day. I discoursed about it with my partner, who thereupon made me a most generous offer. "You know it has been an unlucky ship," said he, "and we both resolve not to go to sea in it again. If your steward (so he called my man) will venture the voyage, I will leave my share of the vessel to him, and let him make the best of it; and if we live to meet in England, and he meets with success abroad, he shall account for 1/2 of the profits of the ship's freight to us, the other shall be his own." If my partner, who was no way concerned with my young man, made him such an offer, I could not do less than offer him the same; and all the ship's company being willing to go with him, we made over half the ship to him in property, and took a writing from him, obliging him to account for the other, and away he went to Japan. The Japan merchant proved a very punctual, honest man to him, protected him at Japan, and got him a license to come on shore, which the Europeans in general have not lately obtained. He paid him his freight very punctually, sent him to the Philippines loaded with Japan and China wares, and a supercargo of their own, who, trafficking with the Spaniards, brought back European goods again, and a great quantity of spices. And there he was not only paid his freight very well, and at a very good price, but not being willing to sell the ship, then the merchant furnished him with goods on his own account, and with some money, and some spices of his own which he brought with him, he went back to the Manillas, where he sold his cargo very well. Here, having made a good acquaintance at Manila, he got his ship made a free ship, and the governor of Manila hired him to go to Acapulco, on the coast of America, and gave him a license to land there, and to travel to Mexico, and to pass in any Spanish ship to Europe with all his men. He made the voyage to Acapulco very happily, and there he sold his ship. And having there also obtained allowance to travel by land to Portobello, he found means to get to Jamaica with all his treasure, and about 8 years after came to England exceeding rich. But to return to our particular affairs, being now to part with the ship and ship's company, it came before us, of course, to consider what recompense we should give to the 2 men that gave us such timely notice of the design against us in the river Cambodia. The truth was, they had done us a very considerable service, and deserved well at our hands, though by the way they were a couple of rogues too; for as they believed the story of our being pirates, and that we had really run away with the ship, they came down to us, not only to betray the design that was formed against us, but to go to sea with us as pirates. One of them confessed afterwards that nothing else but the hopes of going a roguing brought him to do it. However, the service they did us was not the less, and therefore, as I had promised to be grateful to them, I first ordered the money to be paid them which they said was due to them on board their respective ships. Over and above that, I gave each of them a small sum of money in gold, which contented them very well. I then made the Englishman gunner in the ship, the gunner being now made second mate and purser. The Dutchman I made boatswain, so they were both very well pleased, and proved very serviceable, being both able seamen and very stout fellows. We were now on shore in China. If I thought myself banished, and remote from my own country at Bengal, where I had many ways to get home for my money, what could I think of myself now, when I was about 1,000 leagues farther off from home, and destitute of all manner of prospect of return? All we had for it was this, that in about 4 months' time there was to be another fair at the place where we were, and then we might be able to purchase some various manufactures of the country, and withal might possibly find some Chinese junks from Tonquin for sale, that would carry us and our goods whither we pleased. This I liked very well, and resolved to wait; besides, as our particular persons were not obnoxious, so if any English or Dutch ships came thither, perhaps we might have an opportunity to load our goods, and get passage to some other place in India nearer home. Upon these hopes we resolved to continue here, but to divert ourselves, we took 2 or 3 journeys into the country. First, we went 10 days' journey to Nankin, a city well worth seeing. They say it has 1,000,000 of people in it. It is regularly built, and the streets are all straight, and cross one another in direct lines. But when I come to compare the miserable people of these countries with ours, their fabrics, their manner of living, their government, their religion, their wealth, and their glory as some call it, I must confess that I scarcely think it worth my while to mention them here. We wonder at the grandeur, the riches, the pomp, the ceremonies, the government, the manufactures, the commerce, and conduct of these people; not that there is really any matter for wonder, but because, having a true notion of the barbarity of those countries, the rudeness and the ignorance that prevail there, we do not expect to find any such thing so far off. Otherwise, what are their buildings to the palaces and royal buildings of Europe? What their trade to the universal commerce of England, Holland, France, and Spain? What are their cities to ours for wealth, strength, gaiety of apparel, rich furniture, and infinite variety? What are their ports, supplied with a few junks and barks, to our navigation, our merchant fleets, our large and powerful navies? Our city of London has more trade than half their mighty empire. One English, Dutch, or French man of war of 80 guns would be able to fight almost all the shipping belonging to China. But the greatness of their wealth, their trade, the power of their government, and the strength of their armies, may be a little surprising to us, because, as I have said, considering them as a barbarous nation of pagans, little better than savages, we did not expect such things among them. But all the forces of their empire, though they were to bring 2 millions of men into the field together, would be able to do nothing but ruin the country and starve themselves. 1,000,000 of their foot could not stand before one embattled body of our infantry, posted so as not to be surrounded, though they were not to be 1 to 20 in number. Nay, I do not boast if I say that 30,000 German or English foot, and 10,000 horse, well managed, could defeat all the forces of China. Nor is there a fortified town in China that could hold out 1 month against the batteries and attacks of a European army. They have firearms, it is true, but they are awkward and uncertain in their going off, and their powder has but little strength. Their armies are badly disciplined, and want skill to attack, or temper to retreat; and therefore, I must confess, it seemed strange to me, when I came home, and heard our people say such fine things of the power, glory, magnificence, and trade of the Chinese, because, as far as I saw, they appeared to be a contemptible herd or crowd of ignorant, sordid slaves, subjected to a government qualified only to rule such a people, and were not its distance inconceivably great from Muscovy, and that empire in a manner as rude, impotent, and ill governed as they, the Czar of Muscovy might with ease drive them all out of their country, and conquer them in one campaign; and had the Czar, who is now a growing prince, fallen this way, instead of attacking the warlike Swedes, and equally improved himself in the art of war, as they say he has done, and if none of the powers of Europe had envied or interrupted him, he might by this time have been Emperor of China, instead of being beaten by the King of Sweden at Narva, when the latter was not 1 to 6 in number. As their strength and their grandeur, so their navigation, commerce, and husbandry are very imperfect, compared to the same things in Europe. Also in their knowledge, their learning, and in their skill in the sciences, they are either very awkward or defective, though they have globes or spheres, and a smattering of the mathematics, and think they know more than all the world besides. But they know little of the motions of the heavenly bodies, and so grossly and absurdly ignorant are their common people, that when the sun is eclipsed, they think a great dragon has assaulted it, and is going to run away with it; and they fall a clattering with all the drums and kettles in the country, to fright the monster away, just as we do to hive a swarm of bees. As this is the only excursion of the kind which I have made in all the accounts I have given of my travels, so I shall make no more such. It is none of my business, nor any part of my design, but to give an account of my own adventures through a life of inimitable wanderings, and a long variety of changes, which, perhaps, few that come after me will have heard the like of. I shall, therefore, say very little of all the mighty places, desert countries, and numerous people I have yet to pass through, more than relates to my own story, and which my concern among them will make necessary. I was now, as near as I can compute, in the heart of China, about 30 degrees north of the line, for we were returned from Nankin. I had indeed a mind to see the city of Pekin, which I had heard so much of, and Father Simon importuned me daily to do it. At length his time of going away being set, and the other missionary who was to go with him being arrived from Macao, it was necessary that we should resolve either to go or not; so I referred it to my partner, and left it wholly to his choice, who at length resolved it in the affirmative, and we prepared for our journey. We set out with a very good advantage as to finding the way, for we got leave to travel in the retinue of one of their mandarins, a kind of viceroy or principal magistrate in the province where they reside, and who take great state upon them, travelling with great attendance, and great homage from the people, who are sometimes greatly impoverished by them, being obliged to furnish provisions for them and all their attendants in their journeys. I particularly observed in our travelling with his baggage, that though we received sufficient provisions both for ourselves and our horses from the country, as belonging to the mandarin, yet we were obliged to pay for everything we had, after the market price of the country, and the mandarin's steward collected it duly from us. Thus our travelling in the retinue of the mandarin, though it was a great act of kindness, was not such a mighty favour to us, but was a great advantage to him, considering there were above 30 other people travelled in the same manner besides us, under the protection of his retinue; for the country furnished all the provisions for nothing to him, and yet he took our money for them. We were 25 days travelling to Pekin, through a country exceeding populous, but I think badly cultivated; the husbandry, the economy, and the way of living miserable, though they boast so much of the industry of the people. I say miserable, if compared with our own, but not so to these poor wretches who know no other. The pride of the poor people is infinitely great, and exceeded by nothing but their poverty, in some parts which adds to that which I call their misery; and I must needs think the savages of America live more happy than the poorer sort of these, because as they have nothing, so they desire nothing; whereas these are proud and insolent in the main and are in many parts mere beggars and drudges. Their ostentation is inexpressible, and if they can, they love to keep multitudes of servants or slaves, which is to the last degree ridiculous, as well as their contempt of all the world but themselves. I must confess I travelled more pleasantly afterwards in the deserts and vast wildernesses of Grand Tartary than here; and yet the roads here are well paved and well kept, and very convenient for travellers, but nothing was more awkward to me than to see such a haughty, imperious, insolent people, in the midst of the grossest simplicity and ignorance; and my friend Father Simon and I used to be very merry upon these occasions, to see their beggarly pride. For example, coming by the house of a country gentleman, as Father Simon called him, about 10 leagues off the city of Nankin, we had first of all the honour to ride with the master of the house about 2 miles. The state he rode in was a perfect Don Quixotism, being a mixture of pomp and poverty. His habit was very proper for a merry andrew, being a dirty calico, with hanging sleeves, tassels, and cuts and slashes almost on every side. It covered a taffety vest, so greasy as to testify that his honour must be a most exquisite sloven. His horse was a poor, starved, hobbling creature, and 2 slaves followed him on foot to drive the poor creature along. He had a whip in his hand, and he belaboured the beast as fast about the head as his slaves did about the tail; and thus he rode by us, with about 10 or 12 servants, going from the city to his country seat, about half a league before us. We travelled on gently, but this figure of a gentleman rode away before us, and as we stopped at a village about an hour to refresh us, when we came by the country seat of this great man, we saw him in a little place before his door, eating a repast. It was a kind of garden, but he was easy to be seen, and we were given to understand that the more we looked at him the better he would be pleased. He sat under a tree, something like the palmetto, which effectually shaded him over the head, and on the south side, but under the tree was placed a large umbrella, which made that part look well enough. He sat lolling back in a great elbow chair, being a heavy, corpulent man, and had his meat brought him by 2 women slaves. He had 2 more, one of whom fed the squire with a spoon, and the other held the dish with one hand, and scraped off what he let fall upon his worship's beard and taffety vest. Leaving the poor wretch to please himself with our looking at him, as if we admired his idle pomp, we pursued our journey. Father Simon had the curiosity to stay to inform himself what dainties the country justice had to feed on in all his state, which he had the honour to taste of, and which was, I think, a mess of boiled rice, with a great piece of garlic in it, and a little bag filled with green pepper, and another plant which they have there, something like our ginger, but smelling like musk, and tasting like mustard. All this was put together, and a small piece of lean mutton boiled in it, and this was his worship's repast. 4 or 5 servants more attended at a distance, who we supposed were to eat of the same after their master. As for our mandarin with whom we travelled, he was respected as a king, surrounded always with his gentlemen, and attended in all his appearances with such pomp that I saw little of him but at a distance. I observed that there was not a horse in his retinue but that our carriers' pack horses in England seemed to me to look much better, though it was hard to judge rightly, for they were so covered with equipage, mantles, trappings, etc., that we could scarce see anything but their feet and their heads as they went along. I was now light-hearted, and all my late trouble and perplexity being over, I had no anxious thoughts about me, which made this journey the pleasanter to me; in which no ill accident attended me, only in passing or fording a small river my horse fell and made me free of the country, as they call it, that is to say, threw me in. The place was not deep, but it wetted me all over. I mention it because it spoiled my pocket book, wherein I had set down the names of several people and places which I had occasion to remember, and which not taking due care of, the leaves rotted, and the words were never after to be read. At length we arrived at Pekin. I had nobody with me but the youth whom my nephew had given me to attend me as a servant and who proved very trusty and diligent; and my partner had nobody with him but one servant, who was a kinsman. As for the Portuguese pilot, he being desirous to see the court, we bore his charges for his company, and for our use of him as an interpreter, for he understood the language of the country, and spoke good French and a little English. Indeed, this old man was most useful to us everywhere, for we had not been above a week at Pekin, when he came laughing. "Ah, Signor Inglese," says he, "I have something to tell will make your heart glad." "My heart glad?" says I; "what can that be? I don't know anything in this country can either give me joy or grief to any great degree." "Yes, yes," says the old man, in broken English, "make you glad, me sorry." "Why," said I, "will it make you sorry?" "Because," said he, "you have brought me here 25 days' journey, and will leave me to go back alone; and which way shall I get to my port afterwards, without a ship, without a horse, without pecune?" So he called money, being his broken Latin, of which he had abundance to make us merry with. In short, he told us, there was a great caravan of Muscovite and Polish merchants in the city, preparing to set out on their journey by land to Muscovy, within 4 or 5 weeks, and he was sure we would take the opportunity to go with them, and leave him behind, to go back alone. I confess I was greatly surprised with this good news, and had scarce power to speak to him for some time; but at last I said to him, "How do you know this? Are you sure it is true?" "Yes," says he, "I met this morning in the street an old acquaintance of mine, an Armenian, who is among them. He came last from Astrakhan, and was designed to go to Tonquin, where I formerly knew him, but has altered his mind, and is now resolved to go with the caravan to Moscow, and so down the river Volga to Astrakhan." "Well, seignior," says I, "do not be uneasy about being left to go back alone. If this be a method for my return to England, it shall be your fault if you go back to Macao at all." We then went to consult together what was to be done, and I asked my partner what he thought of the pilot's news, and whether it would suit with his affairs. He told me he would do just as I would, for he had settled all his affairs so well at Bengal, and left his effects in such good hands, that as we had made a good voyage, if he could invest it in China silks, wrought and raw, he would be content to go to England, and then make a voyage back to Bengal by the company's ships. Having resolved upon this, we agreed that if our Portuguese pilot would go with us, we would bear his charges to Moscow or to England if he pleased; nor, indeed, were we to be esteemed over generous in that either, if we had not rewarded him further, the service he had done us being really worth more than that. For he had not only been a pilot to us at sea, but he had been like a broker for us on shore; and his procuring for us a Japan merchant was some hundreds of pounds in our pockets. So being willing to gratify him, which was but doing him justice, and very willing also to have him with us besides, for he was a most necessary man on all occasions, we agreed to give him a quantity of coined gold, which, as I computed it, was worth £175 sterling, between us, and to bear all his charges, both for himself and horse, except only a horse to carry his goods. Having settled this between ourselves, we called him to let him know what we had resolved. I told him he had complained of our being willing to let him go back alone, and I was now about to tell him we designed he should not go back at all. that as we had resolved to go to Europe with the caravan, we were very willing he should go with us, and that we called him to know his mind. He shook his head and said it was a long journey, and that he had no pecune to carry him thither, or to subsist himself when he came there. We told him we believed it was so, and therefore we had resolved to do something for him that should let him see how sensible we were of the service he had done us, and also how agreeable he was to us. And then I told him what we had resolved to give him here, which he might lay out as we would do our own; and that as for his charges, if he would go with us we would set him safe on shore, life and casualties excepted, either in Muscovy or England, as he would choose, at our own charge, except only the carriage of his goods. He received the proposal like a man transported, and told us he would go with us over all the whole world; and so we all prepared for our journey. However, as it was with us, so it was with the other merchants; they had many things to do, and instead of being ready in 5 weeks, it was 4 months and some days before all things were got together. Chapter 14. Chapter 14 of the Further Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Further Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, by Daniel Defoe. Chapter 14. Attacked by Tartars. It was the beginning of February, new style, when we set out from Pekin. My partner and the old pilot had gone express back to the port where we had first put in, to dispose of some goods which we had left there, and I, with a Chinese merchant whom I had some knowledge of at Nankin, and who came to Pekin on his own affairs, went to Nankin, where I bought 90 pieces of fine damasks, with about 200 pieces of other very fine silk of several sorts, some mixed with gold, and had all these brought to Pekin against my partner's return. Besides this, we bought a large quantity of raw silk, and some other goods, our cargo amounting, in these goods only, to about £3,500 sterling; which, together with tea and some fine calicoes, and 3 camels' loads of nutmegs and cloves, loaded in all 18 camels for our share, besides those we rode upon; these, with 2 or 3 spare horses, and 2 horses loaded with provisions, made together 26 camels and horses in our retinue. The company was very great, and as near as I can remember, made between 300 and 400 horses, and upwards of 120 men, very well armed and provided for all events; for as the eastern caravans are subject to be attacked by the Arabs, so are these by the Tartars. The company consisted of people of several nations, but there were above 60 of them merchants or inhabitants of Moscow, though of them some were Livonians, and to our particular satisfaction 5 of them were Scots, who appeared also to be men of great experience in business, and of very good substance. When we had travelled 1 day's journey, the guides, who were 5 in number, called all the passengers, except the servants, to a great council, as they called it. At this council every one deposited a certain quantity of money to a common stock, for the necessary expense of buying forage on the way, where it was not otherwise to be had, and for satisfying the guides, getting horses, and the like. Here, too, they constituted the journey, as they call it, viz. They named captains and officers to draw us all up, and give the word of command, in case of an attack, and give every one their turn of command; nor was this forming us into order any more than what we afterwards found needful on the way. The road all on this side of the country is very populous, and is full of potters and earth makers, that is to say, people that temper the earth for the china ware. As I was coming along, our Portuguese pilot, who had always something or other to say to make us merry, told me that he would show me the greatest rarity of all in the country, and that I should have this to say of China, after all the ill-humoured things that I had said of it, that I had seen one thing which was not to be seen in all the world beside. I was very importunate to know what it was. At last he told me it was a gentleman's house built with china ware. Well, says I, are not the materials of their buildings the products of their own country, and so it is all china ware, is it not? No, no, says he, I mean it is a house all made of china ware, such as you call it in England, or as it is called in our country, porcelain. Well, says I, such a thing may be, how big is it? Can we carry it in a box upon a camel? If we can, we will buy it." "Upon a camel!" says the old pilot, holding up both his hands. "Why, there is a family of 30 people lives in it." I was then curious indeed to see it; and when I came to it, it was nothing but this: it was a timber house, or a house built, as we call it in England, with lath and plaster; but all this plastering was really China ware, that is to say, it was plastered with the earth that makes China ware. The outside, which the sun shone hot upon, was glazed, and looked very well, perfectly white, and painted with blue figures, as the large China ware in England is painted, and hard as if it had been burnt. As to the inside, all the walls, instead of wainscot, were lined with hardened and painted tiles, like the little square tiles we call galley tiles in England, all made of the finest china, and the figures exceeding fine indeed, with extraordinary variety of colours, mixed with gold, many tiles making but one figure, but joined so artificially, the mortar being made of the same earth, that it was very hard to see where the tiles met. The floors of the room were of the same composition, and as hard as the earthen floors we have in use in several parts of England, as hard as stone, and smooth, but not burnt and painted, except some smaller rooms, like closets, which were all, as it were, paved with the same tile. The ceiling and all the plastering work in the whole house were of the same earth, and after all, the roof was covered with tiles of the same, but of a deep shining black. This was a China warehouse indeed, truly and literally to be called so; and had I not been upon the journey, I could have stayed some days to see and examine the particulars of it. They told me there were fountains and fish ponds in the garden, all paved on the bottom and sides with the same, and fine statues set up in rows on the walks, entirely formed of the porcelain earth, burnt whole. As this is one of the singularities of China, so they may be allowed to excel in it. But I am very sure they excel in their accounts of it, for they told me such incredible things of their performance in crockery ware, for such it is, that I care not to relate, as knowing it could not be true. They told me in particular of one workman that made a ship with all its tackle and masts and sails in earthenware, big enough to carry 50 men. If they had told me he launched it and made a voyage to Japan in it, I might have said something to it indeed; but as it was, I knew the whole of the story, which was, in short, that the fellow lied; so I smiled and said nothing to it. This odd sight kept me 2 hours behind the caravan, for which the leader of it for the day fined me about the value of 3 shillings, and told me if it had been 3 days' journey without the wall, as it was 3 days within, he must have fined me 4 times as much, and made me ask pardon the next council day. I promised to be more orderly, and indeed I found afterwards the orders made for keeping all together were absolutely necessary for our common safety. In 2 days more we passed the great China wall, made for a fortification against the Tartars, and a very great work it is, going over hills and mountains in an endless track, where the rocks are impassable, and the precipices such as no enemy could possibly enter, or indeed climb up, or where, if they did, no wall could hinder them. They tell us its length is near 1,000 English miles, but that the country is 500 in a straight measured line, which the wall bounds without measuring the windings and turnings it takes. It is about 4 fathoms high, and as many thick in some places. I stood still an hour or thereabouts without trespassing on our orders, for so long the caravan was in passing the gate, to look at it on every side, near and far off. I mean what was within my view; and the guide, who had been extolling it for the wonder of the world, was mighty eager to hear my opinion of it. I told him it was a most excellent thing to keep out the Tartars, which he happened not to understand as I meant it, and so took it for a compliment. But the old pilot laughed. "Oh, Signor Inglese," he says, "you speak in colours." "In colours?" said I. "What do you mean by that?" "Why, you speak what looks white this way and black that way, gay one way and dull another. You tell him it is a good wall to keep out Tartars. You tell me by that it is good for nothing but to keep out Tartars." "I understand you, Signor Inglese, I understand you, but Signor Chinese understood you his own way." "Well," says I, "do you think it would stand out an army of our country people, with a good train of artillery, or our engineers with 2 companies of miners? would not they batter it down in 10 days, that an army might enter in Batalia, or blow it up in the air, foundation and all, that there should be no sign of it left? Ay, ay, says he, I know that. The Chinese wanted mightily to know what I said to the pilot, and I gave him leave to tell him a few days after, for we were then almost out of their country, and he was to leave us a little time after this. But when he knew what I said, he was dumb all the rest of the way, and we heard no more of his fine story of the Chinese power and greatness while he stayed. After we passed this mighty nothing called a wall, something like the Picts' walls so famous in Northumberland, built by the Romans, we began to find the country thinly inhabited, and the people rather confined to live in fortified towns, as being subject to the inroads and depredations of the Tartars, who rob in great armies, and therefore are not to be resisted by the naked inhabitants of an open country. And here I began to find the necessity of keeping together in a caravan as we travelled, for we saw several troops of Tartars roving about, but when I came to see them distinctly, I wondered more that the Chinese empire could be conquered by such contemptible fellows, for they are a mere horde of wild fellows, keeping no order and understanding no discipline or manner of it. Their horses are poor lean creatures, taught nothing, and fit for nothing; and this we found the first day we saw them, which was after we entered the wilder part of the country. Our leader for the day gave leave for about 16 of us to go a hunting as they call it, and what was this but a hunting of sheep? However, it may be called hunting too, for these creatures are the wildest and swiftest of foot that ever I saw of their kind. Only they will not run a great way, and you are sure of sport when you begin the chase, for they appear generally 30 or 40 in a flock, and, like true sheep, always keep together when they fly. In pursuit of this odd sort of game it was our hap to meet with about 40 Tartars, whether they were hunting mutton, as we were, or whether they looked for another kind of prey, we know not; but as soon as they saw us, one of them blew a hideous blast on a kind of horn. This was to call their friends about them, and in less than 10 minutes a troop of 40 or 50 more appeared, at about a mile distance, but our work was over first as it happened. One of the Scots merchants of Moscow happened to be amongst us, and as soon as he heard the horn, he told us that we had nothing to do but to charge them without loss of time, and drawing us up in a line, he asked if we were resolved. We told him we were ready to follow him, so he rode directly towards them. They stood gazing at us like a mere crowd, drawn up in no sort of order at all; but as soon as they saw us advance, they let fly their arrows, which missed us very happily. Not that they mistook their aim, but their distance; for their arrows all fell a little short of us, but with so true an aim, that had we been about 20 yards nearer, we must have had several men wounded, if not killed. Immediately we halted, and though it was at a great distance, we fired, and sent them leaden bullets for wooden arrows, following our shot full gallop, to fall in among them sword in hand, for so our bold Scot that led us directed. He was, indeed, but a merchant, but he behaved with such vigour and bravery on this occasion, and yet with such cool courage too, that I never saw any man in action fitter for command. As soon as we came up to them, we fired our pistols in their faces and then drew, but they fled in the greatest confusion imaginable. The only stand any of them made was on our right, where 3 of them stood, and by signs, called the rest to come back to them, having a kind of scimitar in their hands, and their bows hanging to their backs. Our brave commander, without asking anybody to follow him, gallops up close to them, and with his fusee knocks one of them off his horse, killed the second with his pistol, and the third ran away. Thus ended our fight, but we had this misfortune attending it, that all our mutton we had in chase got away. We had not a man killed or hurt; as for the Tartars, there were about 5 of them killed. How many were wounded we knew not, but this we knew, that the other party were so frightened with the noise of our guns that they fled, and never made any attempt upon us. We were all this while in the Chinese dominions, and therefore the Tartars were not so bold as afterwards; but in about 5 days we entered a vast wild desert, which held us 3 days and nights' march, and we were obliged to carry our water with us in great leathern bottles, and to encamp all night, just as I have heard they do in the desert of Arabia. I asked our guides whose dominion this was in, and they told me this was a kind of border that might be called No Man's Land, being a part of Great Karkathy, or Grand Tartary; that, however, it was all reckoned as belonging to China, but that there was no care taken here to preserve it from the inroads of thieves, and therefore it was reckoned the worst desert in the whole march, though we were to go over some much larger. In passing this frightful wilderness we saw, 2 or 3 times, little parties of the Tartars, but they seemed to be upon their own affairs, and to have no design upon us; and so, like the man who met the devil, if they had nothing to say to us, we had nothing to say to them; we let them go. Once, however, a party of them came so near as to stand and gaze at us. Whether it was to consider if they should attack us or not, we knew not; but when we had passed at some distance by them, we made a rear guard of 40 men, and stood ready for them, letting the caravan pass half a mile or thereabouts before us. After a while they marched off, but they saluted us with 5 arrows at their parting, which wounded a horse so that it disabled him; and we left him the next day, poor creature, in great need of a good farrier. We saw no more arrows or Tartars that time. We travelled near a month after this, the ways not being so good as at first, though still in the dominions of the Emperor of China, but lay for the most part in the villages, some of which were fortified, because of the incursions of the Tartars. When we were come to one of these towns, about 2 days and a half's journey before we came to the city of Naum, I wanted to buy a camel, of which there are plenty to be sold all the way upon that road, and horses also, such as they are, because, so many caravans coming that way, they are often wanted. The person that I spoke to get me a camel would have gone and fetched one for me, but I, like a fool, must be officious, and go myself along with him. The place was about 2 miles out of the village, where it seems they kept the camels and horses feeding under a guard. I walked it on foot, with my old pilot and a Chinese, being very desirous of a little variety. When we came to the place it was a low marshy ground, walled round with stones, piled up dry, without mortar or earth among them, like a park, with a little guard of Chinese soldiers at the door. Having bought a camel and agreed for the price, I came away, and the Chinese that went with me led the camel, when on a sudden came up 5 Tartars on horseback. 2 of them seized the fellow and took the camel from him, while the other 3 stepped up to me and my old pilot, seeing us as it were unarmed, for I had no weapon about me but my sword, which could but ill defend me against 3 horsemen. The first that came up stopped short upon my drawing my sword, for they are arrant cowards; but a second, coming upon my left, gave me a blow on the head, which I never felt till afterwards, and wondered, when I came to myself, what was the matter, and where I was; for he laid me flat on the ground. But my never failing old pilot, the Portuguese, had a pistol in his pocket, which I knew nothing of, nor the Tartars either. If they had, I suppose they would not have attacked us, for cowards are always boldest when there is no danger. The old man seeing me down, with a bold heart stepped up to the fellow that had struck me, and laying hold of his arm with one hand, and pulling him down by main force a little towards him, with the other shot him into the head, and laid him dead upon the spot. He then immediately stepped up to him who had stopped us, as I said, and before he could come forward again, made a blow at him with a scimitar, which he always wore, but missing the man, struck his horse in the side of his head, cut one of the ears off by the root, and a great slice down by the side of his face. The poor beast, enraged with the wound, was no more to be governed by his rider, though the fellow sat well enough too, but away he flew, and carried him quite out of the pilot's reach, and at some distance, rising upon his hind legs, threw down the Tartar and fell upon him. In this interval the poor Chinese came in who had lost the camel, but he had no weapon. However, seeing the Tartar down and his horse fallen upon him, away he runs to him, and seizing upon an ugly weapon he had by his side, something like a poleaxe, he wrenched it from him and made shift to knock his Tartarian brains out with it. But my old man had the 3rd Tartar to deal with still, and seeing he did not fly, as he expected, nor come on to fight him, as he apprehended, but stood stock still, the old man stood still too, and fell to work with his tackle to charge his pistol again; but as soon as the Tartar saw the pistol away he scoured, and left my pilot, my champion I called him afterwards, a complete victory. By this time I was a little recovered. I thought, when I first began to wake, that I had been in a sweet sleep; but as I said above, I wondered where I was, how I came upon the ground, and what was the matter. A few moments after, as sense returned, I felt pain, though I did not know where; so I clapped my hand to my head, and took it away bloody. Then I felt my head ache, and in a moment memory returned, and everything was present to me again. I jumped upon my feet instantly, and got hold of my sword, but no enemies were in view. I found a Tartar lying dead, and his horse standing very quietly by him, and looking further, I saw my deliverer, who had been to see what the Chinese had done, coming back with his hanger in his hand. The old man, seeing me on my feet, came running to me, and joyfully embraced me, being afraid before that I had been killed. Seeing me bloody, he would see how I was hurt, but it was not much, only what we call a broken head. Neither did I afterwards find any great inconvenience from the blow, for it was well again in 2 or 3 days. We made no great gain, however, by this victory, for we lost a camel and gained a horse. I paid for the lost camel and sent for another, but I did not go to fetch it myself. I had had enough of that. The city of Naum, which we were approaching, is a frontier of the Chinese Empire, and is fortified in their fashion. We wanted, as I have said, above 2 days' journey of this city when messengers were sent express to every part of the road to tell all travellers and caravans to halt till they had a guard sent for them, for that an unusual body of Tartars, making 10,000 in all, had appeared in the way, about 30 miles beyond the city. This was very bad news to travellers; however, it was carefully done of the governor, and we were very glad to hear we should have a guard. Accordingly, 2 days after, we had 200 soldiers sent us from a garrison of the Chinese on our left, and 300 more from the city of Naum, and with these we advanced boldly. The 300 soldiers from Naum marched in our front, the 200 in the rear, and our men on each side of our camels, with our baggage and the whole caravan in the center. In this order, and well prepared for battle, we thought ourselves a match for the whole 10,000 Mogul Tartars if they had appeared; but the next day, when they did appear, it was quite another thing. Chapter 15 of the Further Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Further Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, by Daniel Defoe. Chapter 15. Description of an Idol, which they destroy. Early in the morning, when marching from a little town called Changu, we had a river to pass, which we were obliged to ferry, and, had the Tartars had any intelligence, then had been the time to have attacked us, when the caravan being over, the rear guard was behind; but they did not appear there. About 3 hours after, when we were entered upon a desert of about 15 or 16 miles over, we knew by a cloud of dust they raised, that the enemy was at hand, and presently they came upon the spur. Our Chinese guards in the front, who had talked so big the day before, began to stagger, and the soldiers frequently looked behind them, a certain sign in a soldier that he is just ready to run away. My old pilot was of my mind, and being near me called out, "Signor Inglese, these fellows must be encouraged or they will ruin us all, for if the Tartars come on they will never stand it." "I am of your mind," said I, "but what must be done?" "Done?" says he. "Let 50 of our men advance, and flank them on each wing, and encourage them. They will fight like brave fellows in brave company, but without this they will every man turn his back." Immediately I rode up to our leader and told him, who was exactly of our mind. Accordingly 50 of us marched to the right wing and 50 to the left, and the rest made a line of rescue, and so we marched, leaving the last 200 men to make a body of themselves, and to guard the camels, only that, if need were, they should send 100 men to assist the last 50. At last the Tartars came on, and an innumerable company they were. How many we could not tell, but 10,000 we thought at the least. A party of them came on first, and viewed our posture, traversing the ground in the front of our line, and as we found them within gunshot, our leader ordered the 2 wings to advance swiftly, and gave them a salvo on each wing with their shot, which was done. They then went off, I suppose, to give an account of the reception they were like to meet with. Indeed, that salute cloyed their stomachs, for they immediately halted, stood a while to consider of it, and wheeling off to the left, they gave over their design for that time, which was very agreeable to our circumstances. 2 days after we came to the city of Naun or Naum, we thanked the governor for his care of us, and collected to the value of 100 crowns or thereabouts, which we gave to the soldiers sent to guard us, and here we rested 1 day. This is a garrison indeed, and there were 900 soldiers kept here, but the reason of it was, that formerly the Muscovite frontiers lay nearer to them than they now do, the Muscovites having abandoned that part of the country, which lies from this city west for about 200 miles, as desolate and unfit for use; and more especially being so very remote, and so difficult to send troops thither for its defence, for we were yet above 2000 miles from Muscovy properly so called. After this we passed several great rivers, and 2 dreadful deserts, one of which we were 16 days passing over, and on the 13th of April we came to the frontiers of the Muscovite dominions. I think the first town or fortress, whichever it may be called, that belonged to the Czar was called Arguna, being on the west side of the river Arguna. I could not but feel great satisfaction that I was arrived in a country governed by Christians; for though the Muscovites do, in my opinion, but just deserve the name of Christians, yet such they pretend to be, and are very devout in their way. It would certainly occur to any reflecting man who travels the world as I have done, what a blessing it is to be brought into the world where the name of God and a Redeemer is known, adored, and worshipped; and not where the people, given up to strong delusions, worship the devil, and prostrate themselves to monsters, elements, horrid shaped animals, and monstrous images. Not a town or city we passed through but had their pagodas, their idols, and their temples, and ignorant people worshipping even the works of their own hands. Now we came where, at last, a face of the Christian worship appeared, where the knee was bowed to Jesus, and whether ignorantly or not, yet the Christian religion was owned, and the name of the true God was called upon and adored; and it made my soul rejoice to see it. I saluted the brave Scots merchant with my first acknowledgment of this, and taking him by the hand, I said to him, "Blessed be God, we are once again amongst Christians." He smiled and answered, "Do not rejoice too soon, countryman; these Muscovites are but an odd sort of Christians, and but for the name of it you may see very little of the substance for some months further of our journey." "Well," says I, "but still it is better than paganism and worshipping of devils." "Why, I will tell you," says he, "except the Russian soldiers in the garrisons and a few of the inhabitants of the cities upon the road, all the rest of this country, for about 1000 miles farther, is inhabited by the worst and most ignorant of pagans." And so indeed we found it. We now launched into the greatest piece of solid earth that is to be found in any part of the world. We had at least 12,000 miles to the sea eastward, 2,000 to the bottom of the Baltic Sea westward, and above 3,000 if we left that sea, and went on west, to the British and French channels. We had full 5,000 miles to the Indian or Persian Sea south, and about 800 to the Frozen Sea north. We advanced from the river Arguna by easy and moderate journeys, and were very visibly obliged to the care the Czar has taken to have cities and towns built in as many places as it is possible to place them, where his soldiers keep garrison, something like the stationary soldiers placed by the Romans in the remotest countries of their empire, some of which I had read of were placed in Britain, for the security of commerce, and for the lodging of travellers. Thus it was here, for wherever we came, though at these towns and stations the garrisons and governors were Russians, and professed Christians, yet the inhabitants were mere pagans, sacrificing to idols, and worshipping the sun, moon, and stars, or all the host of heaven; and not only so, but were, of all the heathens and pagans that ever I met with, the most barbarous, except only that they did not eat men's flesh. Some instances of this we met with in the country between Arguna, where we enter the Muscovite dominions, and a city of Tartars and Russians together, called Nortziutski, in which is a continued desert or forest, which cost us 20 days to travel over. In a village near the last of these places I had the curiosity to go and see their way of living, which is most brutish and unsufferable. They had, I suppose, a great sacrifice that day, for there stood out, upon an old stump of a tree, a diabolical kind of idol made of wood. It was dressed up, too, in the most filthy manner: its upper garment was of sheepskins, with the wool outward, a great Tartar bonnet on the head, with 2 horns growing through it; it was about 8 feet high, yet had no feet or legs, nor any other proportion of parts. This scarecrow was set up at the outer side of the village, and when I came near to it there were 16 or 17 creatures all lying flat upon the ground round this hideous block of wood. I saw no motion among them, any more than if they had been all logs, like the idol; and at first I really thought they had been so; but when I came a little nearer, they started up upon their feet, and raised a howl as if it had been so many deep mouthed hounds, and walked away, as if they were displeased at our disturbing them. A little way off from the idol, and at the door of a hut, made of sheep and cow skins dried, stood 3 men with long knives in their hands, and in the middle of the tent appeared 3 sheep killed, and 1 young bullock. These, it seems, were sacrifices to that senseless log of an idol. The 3 men were priests belonging to it, and the 17 prostrated wretches were the people who brought the offering, and were offering their prayers to that stock. I confess I was more moved at their stupidity and brutish worship of a hobgoblin than ever I was at anything in my life, and, overcome with rage, I rode up to the hideous idol, and with my sword made a stroke at the bonnet that was on its head, and cut it in 2; and one of our men that was with me, taking hold of the sheepskin that covered it, pulled at it, when behold a most hideous outcry ran through the village, and 200 or 300 people came about my ears, so that I was glad to scour for it, for some had bows and arrows, but I resolved from that moment to visit them again. Our caravan rested 3 nights at the town, which was about 4 miles off, in order to provide some horses which they wanted, several of the horses having been lamed and jaded with the long march over the last desert, so we had some leisure here to put my design in execution. I communicated it to the Scots merchant, of whose courage I had sufficient testimony. I told him what I had seen, and with what indignation I had since thought that human nature could be so degenerate. I told him, if I could get but 4 or 5 men well armed to go with me, I was resolved to go and destroy that vile, abominable idol, and let them see that it had no power to help itself, and consequently could not be an object of worship, or to be prayed to, much less help them that offered sacrifices to it. He at first objected to my plan as useless, seeing that, owing to the gross ignorance of the people, they could not be brought to profit by the lesson I meant to teach them, and added that, from his knowledge of the country and its customs, he feared we should fall into great peril by giving offence to these brutal idol worshippers. This somewhat stayed my purpose, but I was still uneasy all that day to put my project in execution; and that evening, meeting the Scots merchant in our walk about the town, I again called upon him to aid me in it. When he found me resolute, he said that, on further thoughts, he could not but applaud the design, and told me I should not go alone, but he would go with me; but he would go first and bring a stout fellow, one of his countrymen, to go also with us; "and one," said he, "as famous for his zeal as you can desire any one to be, against such devilish things as these." So we agreed to go, only we 3 and my manservant, and resolved to put it in execution the following night about midnight, with all possible secrecy. We thought it better to delay it till the next night, because the caravan being to set forward in the morning, we supposed the governor could not pretend to give them any satisfaction upon us when we were out of his power. The Scots merchant, as steady in his resolution for the enterprise as bold in executing, brought me a Tartar's robe or gown of sheepskins, and a bonnet, with a bow and arrows, and had provided the same for himself and his countrymen, that the people, if they saw us, should not determine who we were. All the first night we spent in mixing up some combustible matter, with aqua vitae, gunpowder, and such other materials as we could get; and having a good quantity of tar in a little pot, about an hour after night we set out upon our expedition. We came to the place about 11 o'clock at night, and found that the people had not the least suspicion of danger attending their idol. The night was cloudy, yet the moon gave us light enough to see that the idol stood just in the same posture and place that it did before. The people seemed to be all at their rest, only that in the great hut where we saw the three priests, we saw a light, and going up close to the door, we heard people talking as if there were 5 or 6 of them. We concluded therefore that if we set wildfire to the idol, those men would come out immediately, and run up to the place to rescue it from destruction, and what to do with them we knew not. Once we thought of carrying it away, and setting fire to it at a distance, but when we came to handle it we found it too bulky for our carriage, so we were at a loss again. The second Scotsman was for setting fire to the hut, and knocking the creatures that were there on the head when they came out, but I could not join with that. I was against killing them, if it were possible to avoid it. "Well then," said the Scots merchant, "I will tell you what we will do. We will try to make them prisoners, tie their hands, and make them stand and see their idol destroyed." As it happened, we had twine or packthread enough about us, which we used to tie our firelocks together with; so we resolved to attack these people first, and with as little noise as we could. The first thing we did, we knocked at the door, when one of the priests coming to it, we immediately seized upon him, stopped his mouth, and tied his hands behind him, and led him to the idol, where we gagged him that he might not make a noise, tied his feet also together, and left him on the ground. 2 of us then waited at the door, expecting that another would come out to see what the matter was, but we waited so long till the 3rd man came back to us, and then nobody coming out, we knocked again gently, and immediately out came 2 more, and we served them just in the same manner, but were obliged to go all with them, and lay them down by the idol some distance from one another; when, going back, we found 2 more were come out of the door, and a 3rd stood behind them within the door. We seized the 2, and immediately tied them, when the 3rd, stepping back and crying out, my Scots merchant went in after them, and taking out a composition we had made that would only smoke and stink, he set fire to it and threw it in among them. By that time the other Scotsman and my man, taking charge of the 2 men already bound, and tied together also by the arm, led them away to the idol, and left them there to see if their idol would relieve them, making haste back to us. When the fuse we had thrown in had filled the hut with so much smoke that they were almost suffocated, we threw in a small leather bag of another kind, which flamed like a candle, and following it in, we found there were but 4 people, who, as we supposed, had been about some of their diabolical sacrifices. They appeared, in short, frightened to death, at least so as to sit trembling and stupid, and not able to speak either, for the smoke. We quickly took them from the hut, where the smoke soon drove us out, bound them as we had done the other, and all without any noise. Then we carried them all together to the idol. When we came there, we fell to work with him. First we daubed him all over, and his robes also, with tar, and tallow mixed with brimstone; then we stopped his eyes and ears and mouth full of gunpowder, and wrapped up a great piece of wildfire in his bonnet. Then sticking all the combustibles we had brought with us upon him, we looked about to see if we could find anything else to help to burn him; when my Scotsman remembered that by the hut, where the men were, there lay a heap of dry forage. Away he and the other Scotsman ran and fetched their arms full of that. When we had done this, we took all our prisoners, and brought them, having untied their feet and ungagged their mouths, and made them stand up, and set them before their monstrous idol, and then set fire to the whole. We stayed by it a quarter of an hour or thereabouts, till the powder in the eyes and mouth and ears of the idol blew up, and as we could perceive, had split altogether; and, in a word, till we saw it burned so that it would soon be quite consumed. We then began to think of going away, but the Scotsman said, "No, we must not go, for these poor deluded wretches will all throw themselves into the fire, and burn themselves with the idol." So we resolved to stay till the forage has burned down too, and then came away and left them. After the feat was performed, we appeared in the morning among our fellow travellers, exceedingly busy in getting ready for our journey, nor could any man suppose that we had been anywhere but in our beds. But the affair did not end so. The next day came a great number of the country people to the town gates, and in a most outrageous manner demanded satisfaction of the Russian governor for the insulting their priests and burning their great Cham Chi Thangu. The people of Nertsinke were at first in great consternation, for they said the Tartars were already no less than 30,000 strong. The Russian governor sent out messengers to appease them, assuring them that he knew nothing of it, and that there had not a soul in his garrison been abroad, so that it could not be from anybody there; but if they could let him know who did it, they should be exemplarily punished. They returned haughtily, that all the country reverenced the great Cham Chi Thangu, who dwelt in the sun, and no mortal would have dared to offer violence to his image but some Christian miscreant, and they therefore resolved to denounce war against him and all the Russians, who, they said, were miscreants and Christians. The governor, unwilling to make a breach, or to have any cause of war alleged to be given by him, the Czar having strictly charged him to treat the conquered country with gentleness, gave them all the good words he could. At last he told them there was a caravan gone towards Russia that morning, and perhaps it was some of them who had done this injury, and that if they would be satisfied with that, he would send after them to inquire into it. This seemed to appease them a little, and accordingly the governor sent after us, and gave us a particular account how the thing was, intimating withal, that if any in our caravan had done it they should make their escape, but that whether we had done it or no, we should make all the haste forward that was possible, and that, in the meantime, he would keep them in play as long as he could. This was very friendly in the governor. However, when it came to the caravan, there was nobody knew anything of the matter, and as for us that we were guilty, we were least of all suspected. However, the captain of the caravan for the time took the hint that the governor gave us, and we travelled 2 days and 2 nights without any considerable stop, and then we lay at a village called Plothus, nor did we make any long stop here, but hastened on towards Jarawina, another Muscovite colony, and where we expected we should be safe. But upon the 2nd day's march from Plothus, by the clouds of dust behind us at a great distance, it was plain we were pursued. We had entered a vast desert, and had passed by a great lake called Shanksozur, when we perceived a large body of horse appear on the other side of the lake, to the north, we travelling west. We observed they went away west as we did, but had supposed we would have taken that side of the lake, whereas we very happily took the south side; and in 2 days more they disappeared again, for they believing we were still before them, pushed on till they came to the Uda, a very great river when it passes farther north, but when we came to it we found it narrow and fordable. The 3rd day they had either found their mistake, or had intelligence of us, and came pouring in upon us towards dusk. We had, to our great satisfaction, just pitched upon a convenient place for our camp, for as we had just entered upon a desert above 500 miles over, where we had no towns to lodge at, and indeed expected none but the city Jarawina, which we had yet 2 days' march to. The desert, however, had some few woods in it on this side, and little rivers, which ran all into the great river Uda. It was in a narrow strait, between little but very thick woods, that we pitched our camp that night, expecting to be attacked before morning. As it was usual for the Mogul Tartars to go about in troops in that desert, so the caravans always fortify themselves every night against them, as against armies of robbers, and it was, therefore, no new thing to be pursued. But we had this night a most advantageous camp, for as we lay between 2 woods, with a little rivulet running just before our front, we could not be surrounded, or attacked any way but in our front or rear. We took care also to make our front as strong as we could, by placing our packs, with the camels and horses, all in a line, on the inside of the river, and felling some trees in our rear. In this posture we encamped for the night. But the enemy was upon us before we had finished. They did not come on like thieves as we expected, but sent 3 messengers to us, to demand the men to be delivered to them that had abused their priests and burned their idol, that they might burn them with fire; and upon this, they said, they would go away and do us no further harm, otherwise they would destroy us all. Our men looked very blank at this message, and began to stare at one another to see who looked with the most guilt in their faces, but nobody was the word, nobody did it. The leader of the caravan sent word he was well assured that it was not done by any of our camp, that we were peaceful merchants traveling on our business, that we had done no harm to them or to anyone else, and that, therefore, they must look further for the enemies who had injured them, for we were not the people; so they desired them not to disturb us; if they did, we should defend ourselves. They were far from being satisfied with this for an answer, and a great crowd of them came running down in the morning, by break of day, to our camp, but seeing us so well posted, they durst come no farther than the brook in our front, where they stood in such number as to terrify us very much. Indeed, some spoke of 10,000. Here they stood and looked at us a while, and then, setting up a great howl, let fly a crowd of arrows among us. But we were well enough sheltered under our baggage, and I do not remember that one of us was hurt. Some time after this we saw them move a little to our right, and expected them on the rear, when a cunning fellow, a Cossack of Jarawina, calling to the leader of the caravan, said to him, "I will send all these people away to Siberia." This was a city 4 or 5 days' journey at least to the right, and rather behind us. So he takes his bow and arrows, and getting on horseback, he rides away from our rear directly, as it were, back to Nertsinske. After this he takes a great circle about, and comes directly on the army of the Tartars as if he had been sent express to tell them a long story that the people who had burned the Cham Chitongu were gone to Sibeilka, with a caravan of miscreants as he called them, that is to say, Christians, and that they had resolved to burn the god Skalisar, belonging to the Tonguses. As this fellow was himself a Tartar, and perfectly spoke their language, he counterfeited so well that they all believed him, and away they drove in a violent hurry to Sibeilka. In less than 3 hours they were entirely out of our sight, and we never heard any more of them, nor whether they went to Sibeilka or no. So we passed away safely on to Jarawina, where there was a Russian garrison, and there we rested 5 days. From this city we had a frightful desert, which held us 23 days' march. We furnished ourselves with some tents here, for the better accommodating ourselves in the night, and the leader of the caravan procured 16 wagons of the country, for carrying our water or provisions, and these carriages were our defence every night round our little camp, so that had the Tartars appeared, unless they had been very numerous indeed, they would not have been able to hurt us. We may well be supposed to have wanted rest again after this long journey, for in this desert we neither saw house nor tree, and scarce a bush; though we saw abundance of the sable hunters, who are all Tartars of Mogul Tartary, of which this country is a part, and they frequently attack small caravans, but we saw no numbers of them together. After we had passed this desert we came into a country pretty well inhabited; that is to say, we found towns and castles, settled by the Czar with garrisons of stationary soldiers, to protect the caravans and defend the country against the Tartars, who would otherwise make it very dangerous travelling. And his Czarish Majesty has given such strict orders for the well guarding the caravans, that, if there are any Tartars heard of in the country, detachments of the garrison are always sent to see the travellers safe from station to station. Thus the governor of Adinskoy, whom I had an opportunity to make a visit to, by means of the Scots merchant, who was acquainted with him, offered us a guard of 50 men, if we thought there was any danger, to the next station. I thought long before this that as we came nearer to Europe we should find the country better inhabited, and the people more civilized; but I found myself mistaken in both, for we had yet the nation of the Tonguses to pass through, where we saw the same tokens of paganism and barbarity as before, only, as they were conquered by the Muscovites, they were not so dangerous, but for rudeness of manners and idolatry no people in the world ever went beyond them. They are all clothed in skins of beasts, and their houses are built of the same. You know not a man from a woman, neither by the ruggedness of their countenance nor their clothes; and in the winter, when the ground is covered with snow, they live underground in vaults, which have cavities going from one to another. If the Tartars had their Cham Chitongu for a whole village or country, these had idols in every hut and every cave. This country, I reckon, was, from the desert I spoke of last, at least 400 miles, half of it being another desert, which took us up 12 days' severe travelling, without house or tree; and we were obliged again to carry our own provisions, as well water as bread. After we were out of this desert and had travelled 2 days, we came to Janezay, a Muscovite city or station, on the great river Janezay, which they told us there parted Europe from Asia. All the country between the river Obi and the river Janezay is entirely pagan, and the people as barbarous as the remotest of the Tartars. I also found, which I observed to the Muscovite governors whom I had an opportunity to converse with, that the poor pagans are not much wiser or nearer Christianity for being under the Muscovite government, which they acknowledged was true enough, but that, as they said, was none of their business; that if the Czar expected to convert his Siberian, Tonguse, or Tartar subjects, it should be done by sending clergymen among them, not soldiers; and they added, with more sincerity than I expected, that it was not so much the concern of their monarch to make the people Christians, as to make them subjects. From this river to the Obi we crossed a wild uncultivated country, barren of people and good management; otherwise it is in itself a pleasant, fruitful, and agreeable country. What inhabitants we found in it are all pagans, except such as are sent among them from Russia; for this is the country, I mean on both sides the river Obi, whither the Muscovite criminals that are not put to death are banished, and from whence it is next to impossible they should ever get away. I have nothing material to say of my particular affairs till I came to Tobolski, the capital city of Siberia, where I continued some time on the following account. We had now been almost 7 months on our journey, and winter began to come on apace; whereupon my partner and I called a council about our particular affairs, in which we found it proper, as we were bound for England, to consider how to dispose of ourselves. They told us of sledges and reindeer to carry us over the snow in the winter time, by which means, indeed, the Russians travel more in winter than they can in summer, as in these sledges they are able to run night and day; the snow being frozen is one universal covering to nature, by which the hills, vales, rivers, and lakes are all smooth and hard as a stone, and they run upon the surface without any regard to what is underneath. But I had no occasion to urge a winter journey of this kind. I was bound to England, not to Moscow, and my route lay 2 ways: either I must go on as the caravan went till I came to Jaroslaw, and then go off west for Narva and the Gulf of Finland, and so on to Danzig, where I might possibly sell my China cargo to good advantage; or I must leave the caravan at a little town on the Dwina, from whence I had but 6 days by water to Archangel, and from thence must be sure of shipping either to England, Holland, or Hamburg. Now to go any one of these journeys in the winter would have been preposterous, for as to Danzig, the Baltic would have been frozen up and I could not get passage; and to go by land in those countries was far less safe than among the Mogul Tartars. Likewise, as to Archangel in October, all the ships would be gone from thence, and even the merchants who dwell there in summer retire south to Moscow in the winter, when the ships are gone; so that I could have nothing but extremity of cold to encounter, with a scarcity of provisions, and must lie in an empty town all the winter. Therefore, upon the whole, I thought it much my better way to let the caravan go, and make provision to winter where I was, at Tobolski in Siberia, in the latitude of about 60 degrees, where I was sure of 3 things to wear out a cold winter with, viz. Plenty of provisions, such as the country afforded, a warm house with fuel enough, and excellent company. I was now in quite a different climate from my beloved island, where I never felt cold, except when I had my ague; on the contrary, I had much to do to bear any clothes on my back, and never made any fire but without doors, which was necessary for dressing my food, etc. Now I had 3 good vests, with large robes or gowns over them, to hang down to the feet, and button close to the wrists, and all these lined with furs, to make them sufficiently warm. As to a warm house, I must confess I greatly dislike our way in England of making fires in every room of the house, in open chimneys, which, when the fire is out, always keeps the air in the room cold as the climate. So I took an apartment in a good house in the town, and ordered a chimney to be built like a furnace, in the centre of 6 several rooms, like a stove; the funnel to carry the smoke went up one way, the door to come at the fire went in another, and all the rooms were kept equally warm, but no fire seen, just as they heat baths in England. By this means we had always the same climate in all the rooms, and an equal heat was preserved, and yet we saw no fire, nor were ever incommoded with smoke. The most wonderful thing of all was, that it should be possible to meet with good company here, in a country so barbarous as this, one of the most northerly parts of Europe. But this being the country where the state criminals of Muscovy, as I observed before, are all banished, the city was full of Russian noblemen, gentlemen, soldiers, and courtiers. Here was the famous Prince Galitzin, the old German Robostiski, and several other persons of note, and some ladies. By means of my Scotch merchant, whom, nevertheless, I parted with here, I made an acquaintance with several of these gentlemen, and from these, in the long winter nights in which I stayed there, I received several very agreeable visits. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of the Further Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Further Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, by Daniel Defoe. Chapter 16. Safe Arrival in England. It was talking one night with a certain prince, one of the banished ministers of state belonging to the Czar, that the discourse of my particular case began. He had been telling me abundance of fine things of the greatness, the magnificence, the dominions, and the absolute power of the Emperor of the Russians. I interrupted him and told him I was a greater and more powerful prince than ever the Czar was, though my dominion were not so large or my people so many. The Russian grandee looked a little surprised, and fixing his eyes steadily upon me, began to wonder what I meant. I said his wonder would cease when I had explained myself, and told him the story at large of my living in the island, and then how I managed both myself and the people that were under me, just as I have since minuted it down. They were exceedingly taken with the story, and especially the prince, who told me, with a sigh, that the true greatness of life was to be masters of ourselves, that he would not have exchanged such a state of life as mine to be Czar of Muscovy, and that he found more felicity in the retirement he seemed to be banished to there than ever he found in the highest authority he enjoyed in the court of his master the Czar; that the height of human wisdom was to bring our tempers down to our circumstances, and to make a calm within, under the weight of the greatest storms without. When he came first hither, he said, he used to tear the hair from his head, and the clothes from his back, as others had done before him. But a little time and consideration had made him look into himself, as well as round him to things without, that he found the mind of man, if it was but once brought to reflect upon the state of universal life, and how little this world was concerned in its true felicity, was perfectly capable of making a felicity for itself, fully satisfying to itself, and suitable to its best ends and desires, with but very little assistance from the world. That being now deprived of all the fancied felicity which he enjoyed in the full exercise of worldly pleasures, he said he was at leisure to look upon the dark side of them, where he found all manner of deformity, and was now convinced that virtue only makes a man truly wise, rich, and great, and preserves him in the way to a superior happiness in a future state. And in this, he said, they were more happy in their banishment than all their enemies were, who had the full possession of all the wealth and power they had left behind them. "Nor, sir," says he, "do I bring my mind to this politically, from the necessity of my circumstances, which some call miserable; but if I know anything of myself, I would not now go back, though the Czar my master should call me, and reinstate me in all my former grandeur." He spoke this with so much warmth in his temper, so much earnestness and motion of his spirits, that it was evident it was the true sense of his soul; there was no room to doubt his sincerity. I told him I once thought myself a kind of monarch in my old station, of which I had given him an account, but that I thought he was not only a monarch but a great conqueror; for he that had got a victory over his own exorbitant desires, and the absolute dominion over himself, he whose reason entirely governs his will, is certainly greater than he that conquers a city. I had been here 8 months, and a dark, dreadful winter I thought it. the cold so intense that I could not so much as look abroad without being wrapped in furs, and a kind of mask of fur before my face, with only a hole for breath, and 2 for sight. The little daylight we had was for 3 months not above 5 hours a day, and 6 at most; only that the snow lying on the ground continually, and the weather being clear, it was never quite dark. Our horses were kept, or rather starved, underground; and as for our servants, whom we hired here to look after ourselves and horses, we had, every now and then, their fingers and toes to thaw and take care of, lest they should mortify and fall off. It is true, within doors we were warm, the houses being close, the walls thick, the windows small, and the glass all double. Our food was chiefly the flesh of deer, dried and cured in the season, bread good enough, but baked as biscuits, dried fish of several sorts, and some flesh of mutton and of buffaloes, which is pretty good meat. All the stores of provisions for the winter are laid up in the summer, and well cured. Our drink was water, mixed with aqua vitae instead of brandy, and for a treat, mead instead of wine, which, however, they have very good. The hunters, who venture abroad all weathers, frequently brought us in fine venison, and sometimes bear's flesh, but we did not much care for the last. We had a good stock of tea, with which we treated our friends, and we lived cheerfully and well, all things considered. It was now March, the days grown considerably longer, and the weather at least tolerable, so the other travellers began to prepare sledges to carry them over the snow, and to get things ready to be going; but my measures being fixed, as I have said, for Archangel, and not for Muscovy or the Baltic, I made no motion, knowing very well that the ships from the south do not set out for that part of the world till May or June, and that if I was there by the beginning of August it would be as soon as any ships would be ready to sail. Therefore I made no haste to be gone, as others did. In a word, I saw a great many people, nay, all the travellers, go away before me. It seems every year they go from thence to Muscovy, for trade, to carry furs and buy necessaries, which they bring back with them to furnish their shops; also others went on the same errand to Archangel. In the month of May I began to make all ready to pack up; and as I was doing this, it occurred to me that, seeing all these people were banished by the Czar to Siberia, and yet when they came there were left at liberty to go whither they would, why they did not then go away to any part of the world wherever they thought fit; and I began to examine what should hinder them from making such an attempt. But my wonder was over when I entered upon that subject with the person I have mentioned, who answered me thus: "Consider first, sir," said he, "the place where we are, and secondly the condition we are in, and especially the generality of the people who are banished thither. We are surrounded with stronger things than bars or bolts; on the north side an unnavigable ocean, where ship never sailed, and boat never swam; every other way we have above 1,000 miles to pass through the Czar's own dominion, and by ways utterly impassable, except by the roads made by the government, and through the towns garrisoned by his troops. In short, we could neither pass undiscovered by the road, nor subsist any other way, so that it is in vain to attempt it." I was silenced at once, and found that they were in a prison every jot as secure as if they had been locked up in the castle at Moscow. However, it came into my thoughts that I might certainly be made an instrument to procure the escape of this excellent person, and that, whatever hazard I ran, I would certainly try if I could carry him off. Upon this I took an occasion one evening to tell him my thoughts. I represented to him that it was very easy for me to carry him away, there being no guard over him in the country, and as I was not going to Moscow, but to Archangel, and that I went in the retinue of a caravan, by which I was not obliged to lie in the stationary towns in the desert, but could encamp every night where I would, we might easily pass uninterrupted to Archangel, where I would immediately secure him on board an English ship, and carry him safe along with me; and as to his subsistence and other particulars, it should be my care till he could better supply himself. He heard me very attentively, and looked earnestly on me all the while I spoke; nay, I could see in his very face that what I said put his spirits into an exceeding ferment; his colour frequently changed, his eyes looked red, and his heart fluttered, till it might be even perceived in his countenance. nor could he immediately answer me when I had done, and, as it were, hesitated what he would say to it; but after he had paused a little, he embraced me, and said, "How unhappy we are, unguarded creatures as we are, that even our greatest acts of friendship are made snares unto us, and we are made tempters of one another!" He then heartily thanked me for my offers of service, but withstood resolutely the arguments I used to urge him to set himself free. He declared in earnest terms that he was fully bent on remaining where he was, rather than seek to return to his former miserable greatness, as he called it, where the seeds of pride, ambition, avarice, and luxury might revive, take root, and again overwhelm him. "Let me remain, dear sir," he said, in conclusion, "let me remain in this blessed confinement, banished from the crimes of life, rather than purchase a show of freedom at the expense of the liberty of my reason, and at the future happiness which I now have in my view, but should then, I fear, quickly lose sight of; for I am but flesh, a man, a mere man, and have passions and affections as likely to possess and overthrow me as any man. Oh, be not my friend and tempter both together!" If I was surprised before, I was quite dumb now, and stood silent, looking at him, and indeed admiring what I saw. The struggle in his soul was so great that, though the weather was extremely cold, it put him into a most violent heat; so I said a word or two, that I would leave him to consider of it, and wait on him again, and then I withdrew to my own apartment. About 2 hours after I heard somebody at or near the door of my room, and I was going to open the door, but he had opened it and come in. "My dear friend," says he, "you had almost overset me, but I am recovered. Do not take it ill that I do not close with your offer. I assure you it is not for want of sense of the kindness of it in you, and I came to make the most sincere acknowledgment of it to you. But I hope I have got the victory over myself." "My lord," said I hope you are fully satisfied that you do not resist the call of heaven." "Sir," said he, "if it had been from heaven, the same power would have influenced me to have accepted it; but I hope, and am fully satisfied, that it is from heaven that I decline it; and I have infinite satisfaction in the parting, that you shall leave me an honest man still, though not a free man." I had nothing to do but to acquiesce, and make professions to him of my having no end in it but a sincere desire to serve him. He embraced me very passionately, and assured me he was sensible of that, and should always acknowledge it; and with that he offered me a very fine present of sables, too much indeed for me to accept from a man in his circumstances, and I would have avoided them, but he would not be refused. The next morning I sent my servant to his lordship with a small present of tea, and 2 pieces of China damask, and 4 little wedges of Japan gold, which did not all weigh above 6 ounces or thereabouts, but were far short of the value of his sables, which, when I came to England, I found worth near £200. He accepted the tea, and 1 piece of the damask, and 1 of the pieces of gold, which had a fine stamp upon it, of the Japanese coinage, which I found he took for the rarity of it, but would not take any more, and he sent word by my servant that he desired to speak with me. When I came to him he told me I knew what had passed between us, and hoped I would not move him any more in that affair, but that since I had made such a generous offer to him, he asked me if I had kindness enough to share the same to another person that he would name to me, in whom he had a great share of concern. In a word, he told me it was his only son, who, though I had not seen him, was in the same condition with himself, and above 200 miles from him, on the other side of the Obi, but that, if I consented, he would send for him. I made no hesitation, but told him I would do it. I made some ceremony in letting him understand that it was wholly on his account, and that seeing I could not prevail on him, I would show my respect to him by my concern for his son. He sent the next day for his son, and in about 20 days he came back with the messenger, bringing 6 or 7 horses, loaded with very rich furs, which, in the whole, amounted to a very great value. His servants brought the horses into the town, but left the young lord at a distance till night, when he came incognito into our apartment, and his father presented him to me, and, in short, we concerted the manner of our travelling, and everything proper for the journey. I had bought a considerable quantity of sables, black fox skins, fine ermines, and such other furs as are very rich in that city, in exchange for some of the goods I had brought from China, in particular for the cloves and nutmegs, of which I sold the greatest part here, and the rest afterwards at Archangel, for a much better price than I could have got at London; and my partner, who was sensible of the profit, and whose business, more particularly than mine, was merchandise, was mightily pleased with our stay, on account of the traffic we made here. It was the beginning of June when I left this remote place. We were now reduced to a very small caravan, having only 32 horses and camels in all, which passed for mine, though my new guest was proprietor of 11 of them. It was natural also that I should take more servants with me than I had before, and the young lord passed for my steward. What great man I passed for myself I know not, neither did it concern me to inquire. We had here the worst and the largest desert to pass over that we met with in our whole journey. I call it the worst, because the way was very deep in some places, and very uneven in others. The best we had to say for it was, that we thought we had no troops of Tartars or robbers to fear, as they never came on this side of the river Obi, or at least very seldom; but we found it otherwise. My young lord had a faithful Siberian servant, who was perfectly acquainted with the country, and led us by private roads, so that we avoided coming into the principal towns and cities upon the great road, such as Tumen, Soloi, Kamaskoy, and several others, because the Muscovite garrisons which are kept there are very curious and strict in their observation upon travellers, and searching lest any of the banished persons of note should make their escape that way into Muscovy. But by this means we were kept out of the cities, so our whole journey was a desert, and we were obliged to encamp and lie in our tents, when we might have had a very good accommodation in the cities on the way. This the young lord was sensible of, that he would not allow us to lie abroad when we came to several cities on the way, but lay abroad himself, with his servant, in the woods, and met us always at the appointed places. We had just entered Europe, having passed the river Kama, which in these parts is the boundary between Europe and Asia, and the first city on the European side was called Soloi Kamaskoy, that is, the great city on the river Kama. And here we thought to see some evident alteration in the people, but we were mistaken; for as we had a vast desert to pass, which is near 700 miles long in some places, but not above 200 miles over where we passed it, so, till we came past that horrible place, we found very little difference between that country and Mogul Tartary. The people are mostly pagans, their houses and towns full of idols, and their way of living wholly barbarous, except in those cities and villages near them, where they are Christians, as they call themselves, of the Greek church, but have their religion mingled with so many relics of superstition, that it is scarce to be known in some places from mere sorcery and witchcraft. In passing this forest, after all our dangers were, to our imagination, escaped, I thought, indeed, we must have been plundered and robbed, and perhaps murdered, by a troop of thieves. Of what country they were I am yet at a loss to know, but they were all on horseback, carried bows and arrows, and were at first about 45 in number. They came so near to us as to be within 2 musket shot, and asking no questions surrounded us with their horses, and looked very earnestly upon us twice. At length they placed themselves just in our way, upon which we drew up into a little line before our camels, being not above 16 men in all. Thus drawn up, we halted, and sent out the Siberian servant, who attended his lord, to see who they were. His master was the more willing to let him go, because he was not a little apprehensive that they were a Siberian troop sent out after him. The man came up near them with a flag of truce, and called to them, but though he spoke several of their languages, or dialects of languages rather, he could not understand a word they said. However, after some signs to him not to come near them at his peril, the fellow came back no wiser than he went; only that by their dress, he said, he believed them to be some Tartars of Kalmuck, or of the Circassian hordes, and that there must be more of them upon the great desert, though he never heard that any of them were seen so far north before. This was small comfort to us; however, we had no remedy. There was on our left hand, at about 1/4 of a mile distance, a little grove, and very near the road. I immediately resolved we should advance to those trees, and fortify ourselves as well as we could there; for, first, I considered that the trees would in a great measure cover us from their arrows, and in the next place they could not come to charge us in a body. It was, indeed, my old Portuguese pilot who proposed it, and who had this excellency attending him, that he was always readiest and most apt to direct and encourage us in cases of the most danger. We advanced immediately, with what speed we could, and gained that little wood; the Tartars, or thieves, for we knew not what to call them, keeping their stand, and not attempting to hinder us. When we came thither we found, to our great satisfaction, that it was a swampy piece of ground, and on the one side a very great spring of water, which, running out in a little brook, was a little farther joined by another of the like size, and was, in short, the source of a considerable river, called afterwards the Vurtska. The trees which grew about this spring were not above 200, but very large, and stood pretty thick; so that as soon as we got in we saw ourselves perfectly safe from the enemy, unless they attacked us on foot. While we stayed here waiting the motion of the enemy some hours, without perceiving that they made any movement, our Portuguese, with some help, cut several arms of trees half off, and laid them hanging across from one tree to another, and in a manner fenced us in. About 2 hours before night they came down directly upon us, and though we had not perceived it, we found they had been joined by some more, so that they were near 80 horse, whereof, however, we fancied some were women. They came on till they were within half shot of our little wood, when we fired one musket without ball, and called to them in the Russian tongue to know what they wanted, and bade them keep off; but they came on with a double fury up to the wood side, not imagining we were so barricaded that they could not easily break in. Our old pilot was our captain as well as our engineer, and desired us not to fire upon them till they came within pistol shot, that we might be sure to kill; and that when we did fire we should be sure to take good aim. We bade him give the word of command, which he delayed so long that they were some of them within 2 pikes' length of us when we let fly. We aimed so true that we killed 14 of them, and wounded several others, as also several of their horses, for we had all of us loaded our pieces with 2 or 3 bullets apiece at least. They were terribly surprised with our fire, and retreated immediately about 100 rods from us; in which time we loaded our pieces again, and seeing them keep that distance, we sallied out, and caught 4 or 5 of their horses, whose riders we supposed were killed; and coming up to the dead, we judged they were Tartars, but knew not how they came to make an excursion such an unusual length. About an hour after they again made a motion to attack us, and rode round our little wood to see where they might break in; but finding us always ready to face them, they went off again, and we resolved not to stir for that night. We slept little, but spent the most part of the night in strengthening our situation, and barricading the entrances into the wood, and keeping a strict watch. We waited for daylight, and when it came, it gave us a very unwelcome discovery indeed. For the enemy, who we thought were discouraged with the reception they met with, were now greatly increased, and had set up 11 or 12 huts or tents, as if they were resolved to besiege us; and this little camp they had pitched upon the open plain, about 3/4 of a mile from us. I confess I now gave myself over for lost, and all that I had. The loss of my effects did not lie so near me, though very considerable, as the thoughts of falling into the hands of such barbarians at the latter end of my journey, after so many difficulties and hazards as I had gone through, and even in sight of our port, where we expected safety and deliverance. As to my partner, he was raging, and declared that to lose his goods would be his ruin, and that he would rather die than be starved, and he was for fighting to the last drop. The young lord, a most gallant youth, was for fighting to the last also, and my old pilot was of opinion that we were able to resist them all in the situation we were then in. Thus we spent the day in debates of what we should do, but towards evening we found that the number of our enemies still increased, and we did not know but by the morning they might still be a greater number. So I began to inquire of those people we had brought from Tobolski if there were no private ways by which we might avoid them in the night, and perhaps retreat to some town, or get help to guard us over the desert. The young lord's Siberian servant told us, if we designed to avoid them, and not fight, he would engage to carry us off in the night to a way that went north toward the river Petrus, by which he made no question but we might get away, and the Tartars never discover it. But, he said, his lord had told him he would not retreat, but would rather choose to fight. I told him he mistook his lord, for that he was too wise a man to love fighting for the sake of it, that I knew he was brave enough by what he had showed already, but that he knew better than to desire 17 or 18 men to fight 500, unless an unavoidable necessity forced them to it, and that if he thought it possible for us to escape in the night, we had nothing else to do but to attempt it. He answered, if his lordship gave him such orders, he would lose his life if he did not perform it. We soon brought his lord to give that order, though privately, and we immediately prepared for putting it in practice. And first, as soon as it began to be dark, we kindled a fire in our little camp, which we kept burning, and prepared so as to make it burn all night, that the Tartars might conclude we were still there; but as soon as it was dark, and we could see the stars, for our guide would not stir before, having all our horses and camels ready loaded, we followed our new guide, who I soon found steered himself by the North Star, the country being level for a long way. After we had travelled 2 hours very hard, it began to be lighter still; not that it was dark all night, but the moon began to rise, so that, in short, it was rather lighter than we wished it to be; but by 6 o'clock the next morning we had got above 30 miles, having almost spoiled our horses. Here we found a Russian village, named Kermazinskoy, where we rested, and heard nothing of the Kalmuck Tartars that day. About 2 hours before night we set out again, and travelled till 8 the next morning, though not quite so hard as before; and about 7 o'clock we passed a little river, called Kurtza, and came to a good large town inhabited by Russians, called Ozomies. There we heard that several troops of Kalmucks had been abroad upon the desert, but that we were now completely out of danger of them, which was to our great satisfaction. Here we were obliged to get some fresh horses, and having need enough of rest, we stayed 5 days, and my partner and I agreed to give the honest Siberian who conducted us thither the value of 10 pistoles. In 5 days more we came to Vyusima, upon the river Vizogda, and running into the Dwina. We were there very happily, near the end of our travels by land, that river being navigable, in 7 days' passage, to Archangel. From hence we came to Lavrimskoy the 3rd of July, and providing ourselves with 2 luggage boats, and a barge for our own convenience, we embarked the 7th, and arrived all safe at Archangel the 18th, having been a year, 5 months, and 3 days on the journey, including our stay of about 8 months at Tobolski. We were obliged to stay at this place 6 weeks for the arrival of the ships, and must have tarried longer, had not a Hamburger come in above a month sooner than any of the English ships, when, after some consideration that the city of Hamburg might happen to be as good a market for our goods as London, we all took freight with him; and having put our goods on board, it was most natural for me to put my steward on board to take care of them, by which means my young lord had a sufficient opportunity to conceal himself, never coming on shore again all the time we stayed there; and this he did that he might not be seen in the city, where some of the Moscow merchants would certainly have seen and discovered him. We then set sail from Archangel the 20th of August the same year, and after no extraordinary bad voyage, arrived safe in the Elbe the 18th of September. Here my partner and I found a very good sale for our goods, as well those of China as the sables, etc. of Siberia, and dividing the produce, my share amounted to £3,475 17 shillings 3 pence, including about £600 worth of diamonds, which I purchased at Bengal. Here the young lord took his leave of us, and went up the Elbe, in order to go to the court of Vienna, where he resolved to seek protection and could correspond with those of his father's friends who were left alive. He did not part without testimonials of gratitude for the service I had done him, and for my kindness to the prince, his father. To conclude, having stayed near 4 months in Hamburg, I came from thence by land to the Hague, where I embarked in the packet, and arrived in London the 10th of January 1705, having been absent from England 10 years and 9 months; and here, resolving to harass myself no more, I am preparing for a longer journey than all these, having lived 72 years a life of infinite variety, and learned sufficiently to know the value of retirement, and the blessing of ending our days in peace. End of chapter 16. End of the Further Adventures of Robinson Crusoe, by Daniel Defoe.